The EUI is the largest doctoral and postdoctoral institution in the social sciences in Europe. And the Robert Schuman Centre, we are the interdisciplinary platform that brings all of the core disciplines, social science disciplines together. We engage in research from basic fundamental to applied policy, and we have a particular remit to engage with the world of practice. And for that reason, I'm absolutely delighted as director to welcome the European Environmental Evaluators Network here to the EUI and to Florence. I see that you meet annually, and this is your fourth meeting, that you move from place to place around Europe, and that this is your first time to come south. So I hope it's not your last. And forums like this are clearly part of that emerging different forms of regional and global governance. In terms of evaluation and its role in policy making and public policy, it's part of a tradition that on a tradition and an assumption that, in my view, is well-founded, that things can be done better, that it's important to discover what works. And of course, it relates to the role of knowledge, the role of evidence, policy learning, how best practices are diffused, and in some sense, how one goes from modelling through to modelling up. In other words, how can problem solving be better given the complexities of the world we live in? And of course, given the focus of your topic, climate and environmental policy on the road to Paris, and not just Paris, but Paris to 2050, then obviously evaluation will be core, because what's required of all of us, our societies, our states, and at every level of government, is nothing short of transformational. Of course, what's interesting is the role of evaluation to politics. And Keynes, who has had many bon mots and good phrases, he once said, "There's nothing a politician likes less than to be well informed. It makes decision-making complex and difficult." And of course, we now live in a world of hyper-complexity, and therefore, the question is, how can evaluation engage with the legacies of the past, with ingrained institutions, ways of doing things, and clearly powerful interests and the rent seekers that are in all of our societies? But I think it's also important in every knowledge community that there's a strong sense of reflectiveness and reflexivity, because there are always dangers in epistemic communities and knowledge communities of groupthink. The world has just gone through a period of groupthink that led to enormous problems in terms of regulation of the financial systems, and also fashion. So I think both the world of the political needs to understand more the role of evaluation, but equally those who engage in the rationalist side and the evidence side of the policy process must always be attentive to groupthink, to fashion, and to always retain a place and a presence for discordant and awkward voices. Too often in our world today, we don't listen to the discordant and the awkward voices, and sometimes at a very high cost. But that said, I'm delighted that you're all here. I'd like to thank the Florence School of Regulation, and particularly the Florence School, the Climate Unit, who are your hosts today. We're delighted, as I said, to have you here, and I look forward very much to the keynote addresses this morning. And I now hand over to the director of the Florence School, to Jean-Michel Glachant, who will introduce our two keynote speakers. But thank you all, and enjoy Florence, and enjoy your time at the EUI.
Thank you, Brigid. Ladies and gentlemen, I am more than happy welcoming you here, not because it is you, not because it is me, not because even for the speakers, but because of the topic. From Paris COP21 to 2050, we have one of the most challenging issues for humanity. For us Europeans, it is as big as the two world wars that we got in the 20th century. Of course, this war will be cold, but it's a war. It's mainly a war against ourselves, and we have to win it. So which way we will do, we do not know exactly. When we will win, we do not know, but we have to win it. And you are one of the key, because your job is to evaluate, so to assess, to rank, to give points, etc., to choose or to help the choice. Here at Florence School, we do mainly energy and climate. Climate is Xavier Labandera, energy is me. We are totally aware of the responsibilities we have as Europeans, as academics, as policymakers, and we hope we will make it. This morning we have two outstanding lecturers. One is a politician, and we need politicians, and we cannot do anything without them. One is a typical, very high-level civil servant, and we also need very high civil servants to have public authorities engaged and pushing things. We will have first the politician lecturing, then the civil servant. The politician is, I will do my best to pronounce the name, but there is something unfamiliar with Dutch, is the way they pronounce only the J. No, the G. Gerben-Jan Gerbrandy. I do not know where it is coming from. For me, it looks like a mix of Spanish and Arabic, but that's it. So Gerben is really highly qualified. He's member of the parliament. He's not only member of the parliament, but he's a key person. He's vice chair of the Committee for Environment, Health and Food Safety. And like very dynamic parliament members, he's also a member of the Budgetary Control and substitute member to the Budget Committee. So he really knows what it is, and he does what is done. On the top of this, he is also vice chair of Euronest, which is a link between the parliament and our neighbors on the eastern border. He is a contact person for the European Environment Agency and many other things, but the one I did give are enough to understand that the speech, the lecture he will give us is really from someone knowing what is at stake and pushing things to have it done. And the second one I will introduce after the first. Gerben has 20 minutes as package to speak and to take one or two clarification questions, only to clarify, not to discuss. That's the rule. And again, very, very happy to welcome you. Gerben, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for this very kind introduction. And thank you for inviting me here. It's a great honor being here among so many very important evaluators. You had so much trust in me that you did not even give my speech a title, which does not happen very often. I had been thinking about a title, but when I arrived here in this wonderful environment, which I would like to call romantic as well, I thought, why not call or give the title of my speech A Happy Couple? And I'll explain why I take that title, A Happy Couple. And that's actually, it comes with a question mark, a happy couple question mark, although I've learned that you can never have a question mark behind the title. And I'm talking about this because I believe politics and science have a very difficult marriage. And since I've been told that marital fights are often very nasty fights, I'm afraid so is this one. Politics and science have a very difficult marriage. And since I'm most probably the only politician here, surrounded by numerous scientists, it wouldn't be wise for me to pick up that fight here. But even if that would be the other way around, I would choose your side, simply because I strongly believe in science-based politics. Maybe because I'm the son of a teacher and a researcher, and maybe because I represent a party that prefers rationale and pragmatism to political ideology. So I'm a politician who believes in science-based politics. And to be frank, that's actually a pretty weird statement to say that you're in favor of science-based politics. Shouldn't we all take science as a starting point for policies? I see you're nodding, but I wouldn't be surprised if you agree with that. Yes, of course. But what if science undermines your political ideology? What if you're a convinced communist being confronted with a very successful market economy? Or what if you're a nationalist believing in an autarkic state confronted with something like climate change, asking for international solution? Only a few adapt their ideology. Most choose to challenge science. But taking one's political ideology as an unchangeable ideology is just one explanation for fact-free politics. I'm afraid the most important explanation is to be described as interests. Financial interests and, of course, the interests of power. And I'll give you two quotes. The first one is, "This generation has altered the composition of the atmosphere on a global scale through a steady increase in carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels." That's the first quote. The second one is, "I don't believe man-made global warming is settled in science enough." Both these quotes come from the United States, and they're obviously opposing each other. The latter is very recent and was made by a quite prominent Republican candidate for the US presidency, and it's clearly attacking the science behind climate change. The first one was made by a US president during his State of the Union in 1965. That's 50 years ago. And how on earth is it possible that in the one country where the best universities in the world are located, a man who might become the leader of this country is totally neglecting, no, even worse, who is deliberately contradicting science in what might be the most challenging policy area of our times? Does he really believe in what he says? And the answer, of course, is no. No, these climate deniers, they do not believe that climate scientists are wrong. What they do know, however, is that they have no chance whatsoever of ever becoming president if they join the voices of science, simply because scientists and environmentalists are not financing their electoral campaigns. They receive donations from big oil, from mining companies, investors in conventional industries. So it's not science-based politics, it's dollar-based politics. And yes, of course, in Europe, we also have something like that called euro-based politics. But compared to the US, the level of fact-free politics is relatively low. Private financing of politics is not as dominant in Europe as it is in the US, but that is one of the reasons. The other has to do with political system. Quite often people are not really aware of the differences in political systems. Yes, they make the distinction between a republic and a monarchy, but how many people are aware of the fundamental differences between even European national parliaments and the European Parliament? At national level, there exist government parties and opposition parties. That most often defines one's political position. That distinction does not exist in the European Parliament. Majorities are changing all the time. And yes, they're often based on ideology, but arguments play a very dominant role as well. And therefore, content is never far away in the debate in European Parliament. But okay, let's assume that we are in favor of fact-based politics. The second challenge is to get the right facts. And that sounds silly, but you don't want to know how often I'm confronted with information that has been very kindly interpreted by someone with a very particular interest. Neutral facts are almost non-existent in politics. And I'll say that again because I think it's a very crucial message to you. Neutral facts are almost non-existent in politics. Trust and neutrality are here the crucial words. How trustworthy is the source? If a car manufacturer tells me that they can impossibly comply with certain standards we are discussing, I have my doubts. But if a professor from MIT tells me the same, I would consider changing my position. And let's be honest, it's the reason that the trustworthiness and neutrality of certain scientists is deliberately attacked. A special kind of facts are based on policy evaluations. They can generate knowledge on the basis of experience and what works and what does not, and especially why. So it's crucial intelligence for politicians, I would say. And the key question for you as evaluators could be what type of evaluation information is useful in the European Parliament decision-making setting. I would say focus on economic efficiency, effectiveness, and policy consistency. Since you are concentrating on climate policy this week, I will give an example in this field, and that's carbon leakage in the EU's emission trading scheme. And I assume you know the term. It refers to companies moving out of Europe or going bankrupt due to high carbon prices. And to avoid this so-called carbon leakage, they are given carbon credits for free. There are very important questions to be asked about carbon leakage. In general, politicians are strongly convinced about the existence of carbon leakage. But is that really the case? Just a few questions. Were the carbon leakage measures necessary for all sectors? Has free allocation of emission allowances helped to prevent carbon leakage? Was free allocation the most cost-efficient measure to prevent carbon leakage? Did carbon leakage occur so far? And how effective were the measures compared to alternatives? Unfortunately, these questions hardly play a role in the policy debate. Carbon leakage is a given, whether it exists or not. And your work, the evaluators' work, is crucial here, but not sufficiently listened to. Many reports by the European Court of Auditors, the Environment Agency, universities, and many other institutions are not taken into account. Often they are presented and then they disappear in a drawer. That's unfortunate, but it's a fact of life. And I do have a few suggestions how to improve the impact of policy evaluations. And I'll come up with 3. And you all know this, but please tell your colleagues when you're back home. First of all, politicians do not read reports of hundreds of pages. So the message has to be brief and simple, even if you scientifically believe the world is much more complex than that. And please do not just limit yourself to having an executive summary in a 500-page document. That's not enough. No, you have to create a separate short version of your message, and please include images. They often work much better than old sentences. Secondly, timing, timing, timing. Presenting a report at the end of July is a guarantee to end up in a drawer. So is the evaluation that comes too late for the development of new policy. And that sounds evidently, but trust me, even my drawer is full of them. Thirdly, think about the presentation. Get media attention. Whether you like it or not, we live in a world excessively dominated by the media. So live in that world and make use of it. I think NGOs have shown the way. And once again, you are perfectly aware, of course, but please tell your colleagues. Finally, Chair, I would like to touch upon a problem where we badly need the knowledge of policy evaluators. Are the policy instruments that we have developed since we started with environmental legislation in the 60s and 70s still sufficient for today's world? These policy instruments are based on the assumption that public authorities are in charge. But is that still the case? The biggest companies in the world would almost be a member of the G20 when you list them in the world's GDP order. Their influence in the world is larger than a large majority of all countries. And in addition to that, innovation takes place at such a pace nowadays that we as legislators are always constantly running behind. More and more private companies take the lead in making our economies more sustainable, not because they suddenly want to save planet Earth, but simply because it makes economically sense. And I'll give you an example. It was a coalition of 3 companies, Unilever, Coca-Cola, and McDonald's, that has revolutionized the world's refrigerators market. They teamed up to replace HFC-based refrigerators in countries with hydrocarbon-based fridge systems. And only after sustained pressure, policymakers in the US allowed the HFC-free technology access to the American market. And also in Europe, we have only revised a year ago the EU's F-gases regulation, catching up with already ongoing trends. It means that we as legislators have to innovate as well. The big question is how. Not by total withdrawal, I don't believe in such a laissez-faire state, but how to find the right balance. How can we allow companies that drive the change to do so without endangering other public interests? Transparency might be one of the key elements here, but I need your help. You must have evaluated pilots, tryouts in this field, so please let me know. An appealing example is the UK Climate Change Act, adopted in 2008. It puts in place the absolute obligation for the government to achieve an 80% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2050, and it gives a crucial role to the Climate Change Committee, which advises the government on the progress and policies towards this target. Its membership is not made of administrators or politicians, but academics. And let me conclude. The role of knowledge is crucial in developing the right future policies. But due to the nature of politics, knowledge itself is not sufficient. Politicians need to be forced to make better use of science and policy evaluations, not by telling them to do so, but by seducing them on the one hand, and by making science speak for itself on the other, often through the media and by being more vocal as researchers. And I would also like to challenge you to look how policies can be designed so to become more effective. How can we develop the new innovative policy tools that I was talking about? The fact that you're here shows that you have taken up that challenge, and I'm more than looking forward to working on that together with you. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Gerben, and thanks to remind us that if we do not speak to politicians in a language they can understand, of course it is that we do not speak, so we do not say anything, so we cannot claim anything. If we do not speak to someone, what can we expect? We can expect this person to behave as he or she uses this to behave. And then we have a second lecture, very high level again, but from a different part of the decision making, Artur Runge-Metzger. Artur is Director for International Climate Strategy at DG Climate. Since 12 years, he has been one of the leading chief negotiators in the UN climate negotiation, so he knows better than anyone in the room, I guess, what is an international negotiation, how it works, and why we have the results that we have and what we can expect. Of course, he won't give us all the tricks because he cannot. A negotiator is somebody looking for results and keeping some tricks under the table. That's normal. And very interesting also, he is vice president of the UNFCCC bureau presently. So Artur is really the guy we would like to unlock the brain and to steal all the memories in it. Maybe we will be able to do after 2050. Today the tools we have to extract from someone intimate thought is too limited, and we can only rely on lecture. So Artur, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Jean-Michel, for the very kind words. And I must say, when I saw Gerben-Jan on the agenda, I thought, my goodness, maybe our talks are going to be very, very similar. They are not going to be very similar. I really come from a different perspective. And today, I'm not coming from the side of the negotiator, but the other side of the medal, that is, we also need to implement what we have negotiated at a certain point in time. And I have a presentation. I don't know whether that could be uploaded. I don't know where it is.
We're trying to do something, but as I am a boss, I do not know anything with practical.
I think it's in the upper left corner, and then I can use this.
There is an old French saying that when somebody is useless, you can push it to be the boss because he won't harm anybody. He or she, but he in my case, of course.
Thank you very much. Good. What I want to do is to really look at the other side in terms of implementation. And I want to start off with, because I see so many young faces in the room, how this whole field of EU climate energy policy was evolving. Look at the development of the greenhouse gases, and then we'll start talking about ex post evaluation, which is the topic here, and present a little few cases that have been done. But I then expand a lot on key challenges, policy questions, and that is where I'm going to meet Gerben-Jan again, because that is, I think, the meeting point, and I come with some few conclusions. The whole thing started in the early 90s when the United Nations Framework Convention was really established, and all of that, of course, on the basis of science. The IPCC had done its first report. Everybody knew, yeah, there is something going on with the climate. And that international side was also then driving what was happening in Europe. But if you look at European climate policies, I think one thing you need to take into account is that the real starting point of it is only the 1st of January 2005. And that's only 10 years ago. And I think for you who are going to do ex post evaluations, that means the time series of data you have is going to be relatively short. What we had before the year 2005 was we had quite a number of environmental policies in Europe and also energy policies that had a positive impact on greenhouse gases. But they were not designed in order to drive down greenhouse gases. They were designed to do many other things, kind of clean up the energy side or reduce ozone-depleting substances. The Montreal Protocol was already in place. So I would say before 2005, and we came up with something like 42 measures, and you will find them in our reports, of those things in other sectors that had positive implications on greenhouse gases. That even included the common agriculture policy. When you then look at the development of EU climate and energy policy, the flagship has been mentioned by Gerben-Jan, the European Union emissions trading system. And that started with a pilot project, because in Europe there was no experience with emissions trading or market-based policy instruments. At the time, I think all our slides started in saying we have a paradigm shift in environmental policy making. We go away from control and command more to market-based instruments. I think that was the saying at the time. And the ETS has been evolving, and we have been on the really steep end of the learning curve on the ETS side. And there's many things that happened over time, and we are trying to improve it gradually. I think the last addition to this is the Market Stability Reserve. That was very important. And we also broadened the energy and climate policies. We added the effort sharing that covers the 55% of EU emissions that are not part under the EU ETS, so that's households, transport, and agriculture non-CO2 emissions. And if you look into the future, we also would like to add land use change, and forestry to the EU policy catalogue. But that, of course, is not all. There is a plethora of other policies that are supporting climate policies. Gerben-Jan, you mentioned the F-gases regulation on the industrial side. And again, the F-gases was really targeted towards greenhouse gases. But what also happened at the same time is that the policymakers saw that it is an integrated policy. You cannot do climate policies without looking particularly at the energy sector. So when we looked at policies until the year 2020, we were talking about a climate and energy package, looking at these two policies together. But it was mainly the ETS, it was renewables and energy efficiency. When we now look forward beyond 2020, we even go broader. We now talk about the energy union, and the climate policy is going to be part of that. And that also talks about energy security, it talks about integrated markets, it talks about interconnection, it talks about research and innovation. So what we see that despite the fact that the policy is a very young policy, it is getting broader and broader. You have more objectives that you have to take into account. Looking back at the ETS in its first stage, it was really meant to look at emission reductions. Now we talk many more things. It goes as far as looking at jobs, growth, and so on. So things have become more complex very quickly. And I think that is very important for those who do ex post evaluation. How do we do policy making? Of course, we have this very rational cycle of preparation, and then we do the assessments, and then we adopt it, Council and the Parliament, who are the legislators. Then we go into implementation, and at a certain stage there should be monitoring and evaluation. We are very strong on the preparatory side, and we have been using economic instruments even before we signed the Kyoto Protocol, and we have refined our instruments. We do a lot of modeling, and that we have been investing in these instruments to help guiding the decision-making of the politicians. The impact assessment has become a little bit like a golden calf in this whole thing, and I'm not sure whether we are not starting to overdo it. But there were also shortcomings. In the adoption process, the impact assessment was forgotten, put aside, and then the Council and the Parliament could make suggestions, amendments to the proposals, and nobody was really looking at what were the implications of those proposals. Now, in the Parliament and in the Council, there's also a tendency to look at impact assessments. Monitoring, yes, we monitor our greenhouse gas emissions very well. Every year we come with reports, the T-2 reports, so it's 2 years after the emissions occurred for the entire economy. For the emissions trading system, it's T-1, so the year before the emissions, you will know where we were. Still, this is really reporting and monitoring, but it's not policy evaluation. I think policy evaluation so far is relatively underdeveloped. And then one of the reasons was really that we have these short timelines. Only since 2005 we would talk about the emissions. And how have they developed over time, these emissions? You can see here the red line in the middle. Emissions have been going down. We have this data set not only for the EU, we have them for individual member states, we have them sector by sector, and even broken down subsector by subsector. So we have a great granularity in terms of the data collection when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. And we can say in which sectors emissions were going down, we know in which sectors emissions were going up. And then we see this curve, which is kind of in the beginning, in the 90s, was going a little bit up and down. And every year with the European Environment Agency, we tried to explain, okay, what has happened last year? Was it a warm winter? Was it a cold winter? In which countries were there more emissions? Why was that the case? That is a kind of evaluation, just looking at the numbers and trying to see what is the reason for emissions evolving. But this is what I would think a very simplistic way of looking at the data. I think we need much deeper knowledge of what is really driving the emissions. And there's only very few examples that we have at the present point in time. And one, this was done by the Dutch Bureau of Plan, what is the Planning Bureau, that was looking at the early phase, the Stone Age of climate policies, when it was really driven by environmental policies. They were looking at, okay, what is the counterfactual? If those 9 environmental or 8 environmental policies they had been looking at would not have been implemented, where would have emissions gone? And they could clearly have an implication and say, yes, these policies worked. And it was, as you can see, in the non-CO2 side, that was the Montreal Protocol and the ozone-depleting substances, that legislation that was helping also to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And then on the CO2 side, it was a lot, and the other thing on the non-CO2 side is the waste management, where there was a lot of legislation in the 80s and the 90s that improved the situation. On the CO2 side, it was mainly the renewables policies that were starting to come into effect. Apart from that, evaluations, you see sometimes very crude ones, like here, somebody looking at what is the effect of the cars and vans regulations, and here we are looking particularly at the type of instruments. We started with voluntary agreements in the beginning, then we were announcing this is not enough in terms of the rate of change. We were announcing regulation, and then in the final phase we started implementing regulation. I think that's exactly what Gerben-Jan was referring to, the car manufacturer saying, oh, it can't be done. But when we really got tight, things moved much faster than what we thought. So we have a very strong belief in our DG in European engineering. We have also been looking at the structural drivers behind EU greenhouse gas emissions, and this is an analysis that was done with the European Environment Agency to see what are these different structural drivers. Is it the energy intensity? Is it the carbon intensity? How is the GDP affecting the emissions? And these are very interesting results that show that, yes, some policies are working because they change, for instance, the carbon intensity. They change energy intensity. And we also know that the GDP and the change of GDP had some influence. Look here at 2 different timelines over the last 15 years on the emissions. But it was not only the economic decline, because that was a big question over the last years. Is it only the economic decline that is reducing emissions? So the level of production, particularly an important question when we discuss the EU ETS. A fourth one is the whole issue around cost efficiency. And that is a question that is being put forward more and more. What are the implicit carbon prices that come through different policies? And then you compare them to the carbon prices. And here you see a comparison saying, okay, what is it to drive solar energy into the system? What does it cost you to drive wind energy in practice into the system? And where do we stand with the carbon price? And you see there is big inefficiencies, you would say. That's one conclusion you could take. But you could also say, look, everybody knows if we want to innovate, we might have to push in the beginning, and over time these costs are going to reduce. So maybe this is more a timeline. You start high, you go down, and you get close to the real carbon price. That is going to do then the major deployment of a technology. In the infant stages, technologies might need more support. My colleagues have been putting together a vast number of policy questions that are still open, and where I think you as the evaluator community should be very interested in. I'm not going to go line by line through all these questions, but some of the key questions are these multiple objectives we have set ourselves: energy security, carbon leakage competitiveness, innovation. How can we look at these things in the context of ex-post evaluation? We cannot just only look at greenhouse gas emissions. And then we have to do that in the different sectors, and we have to look at the economics there. There's a lot of very interesting questions that need to be answered. Furthermore, the same is true in a particular area, agriculture, land use change, and forestry, which is a very difficult area because numbers in this are changing a lot. All the inventories are subject to changes all over the time. There is the link with the common agriculture policy. These are very important and very interesting ex-post evaluation questions, because some of the member states have started to do climate policies also in that area. But how successful have they been through their rural development programs to drive down emissions? That is a question we can't answer in Brussels, we don't know, but we would be interested to get an answer from the scientific community. One thing I haven't mentioned is adaptation, and I think I could spend another hour on just talking about adaptation, but it's not to be forgotten that this is also something where we will have to look more into. It's probably more at the level of the member states than at the level of the European Union. Still, if you want to learn, it's good to do it together with 28 member states and not one by one. And then finally, it's almost my last slide, in terms of the more general questions, is also what does this mean, the climate policy, in terms of growth and jobs? Jobs is one of the big questions at the present point in time. Every policy proposal you make will ask, so what is that going to do to unemployment in Spain, unemployment in Greece, unemployment in Italy? And this is certainly not something we had been focusing on a lot. The link between climate policies and the employment side is a very weak one analytically. And I think that requires much more work in the coming years to see what are the different effects. What we also need to be better at, and Gerben-Jan, you were referring to this as well, is what is a rational climate policy? Indeed, in Europe we have a long list of policies that all have an impact on greenhouse gases. And we have had this big discussion when we were coming out with the 2030 package. Does Europe really need a renewables target? Does Europe really need energy efficiency targets that are going to be broken down to the level of each member state? Or are we overdoing it? Is the carbon price not able to do this job? So these are questions that are still unanswered. The package says at the moment, yes, we should continue with the greenhouse gases, break them down to the level of member states. But when it comes to renewables and energy efficiency, maybe there is a better, a more flexible way of implementing them. But I would think the jury is still out on that. We don't know whether that is going to work, yes or no. But just look at the energy efficiency side. Energy efficiency is not driven by a single policy where you say, oh, now this has been broken down to individual member states. No, there is a plethora of legislation that is behind it. Is legislation for buildings, is individual legislation for the energy efficiency of appliances, is individual legislation for eco-design of products. It's a huge amount and hundreds of pages of legislation that is in place. And the question that Gerben-Jan was placing and saying, is industry not running faster than European legislation? I think in some of these smaller pieces of legislation, you will see that. On the energy efficiency labeling, we have run out of labels. We are at A with 3 stars in order to say this is the highest category. And if you go into a shop, you will not find a B category, almost no B category, or a C category, or a D category. So how can we make all of this more dynamic in the future, knowing that as soon as you propose it, even before you propose it, industry is going to come, or the shop owners are going to come and say, now I have to relabel every fridge in my shop? Oh no, I don't want to do that. So these are questions that we will have to deal with when it comes to policy evaluation. So also in terms of the governance side, in terms of how it's being implemented and what are the costs of implementation. In our impact assessments, this is a very difficult area to estimate. What is the cost, the burden for small and medium-sized enterprises, for even larger enterprises, the shop owners. And there is where I think we need more positive analysis, meaning bring the evidence from the field. Now I conclude. Climate policy is still it's a toddler in terms of policy making in Europe. It's just a bit more than 10 years old. So treat it also with some, be kind to it, because it still has to grow and it has to move forward to become a real grown-up. Climate policies, apart from reducing emissions and increasing resilience, have to observe a growing number of other multiple policy objectives. Growth, jobs, competitiveness, innovation, fairness across member states, fairness across households in Europe, cohesion. And that is a particular challenge for ex-post evaluation. There is a plethora of policies and measures at play with strong interlinkages, and I don't think we have yet fully understood how they work with each other. So I would also say that ex post evaluation in the field of climate policy is in its infancy. So it's even younger than the toddler. It's probably hasn't really gotten up the ground and started walking. There's a need for robust knowledge to help policymakers, legislators to make the right decisions. There's many open questions. There's also an increasing, and not only domestic, from the European Parliament and from the Council, from the member states, but there is an international political demand for simplification and better regulation and evidence-based policymaking. And that brings me to Paris. Because what is the significance of Paris really in December? Many will look at 2 degrees. Are we going to reach 2 degrees, yes or not? I don't think that this is the most significant. The most significant for me is that we get many, many more countries onto the other side of the coin. No longer to just go to these international COPs and negotiate nicely about climate change, but to start implementing policies and doing policies. And that is where we in Europe really see a growing interest. There's more and more people coming to Brussels, and I think also to Copenhagen, to understand how have you been doing it over the last 10 years? What are your good experiences, your bad experiences? We are very deeply involved in discussions with our Chinese colleagues when it comes to the EU ETS. And I'm always joking with the Chinese minister saying, but make sure that you are not going to make that same mistake. You should not go back to your legislation in order to have an MSR. Just do it right from the beginning. We should have done it in the same way. So that is, I think, something also on the international side that is becoming very interesting and very important. And there we need the evidence from the ex post evaluations. Because it's nice to believe in your truisms that you have built in your ivory towers, whether it is in the administration or whether it's in the council or the parliament. But at the end of the day, you really need to look at reality, what is happening on the ground, and is what you are doing having an effect on emissions or not? Or is it completely different drivers that are at hand, be it the oil price or other market forces? Thank you very much.
Thank you.